There's a guy named Marcus who spent 2 years saving money, watching videos, and carefully planning his dream tiny home. He bought land in Tennessee, hired a contractor, and broke ground in the spring. 14 months later, he was still waiting. The permits alone took 6 months. The foundation cost more than he had budgeted for the entire structure. By the time his tiny home was finally finished, he had spent 40% more than originally planned, and he was exhausted in a way he had never expected a dream to make him feel. Then his neighbor, a guy named Derek, put up something Marcus had never seen before. It went up in a single weekend. No contractor, no permit nightmare, no poured foundation. Just Derek, 2 friends, a rented truck, and a row of curved black metal panels that snapped together like the biggest assembly kit you have ever seen in your life. By Sunday evening, Derek was standing inside a dry, insulated, structurally solid structure that looked nothing like any tiny home Marcus had ever seen on the internet. And Marcus stood at his fence with one very uncomfortable question forming slowly in the back of his mind. What if he had done it completely wrong? That question is exactly what we're going to answer today. Because something genuinely important is happening right now in the world of small, affordable housing. Traditional tiny homes, the cedar-clad, shiplap interior, lofted sleeping kind that dominated every home show and Instagram feed for a full decade, are quietly losing ground. Not because people stop wanting affordable, simple, efficient housing, but because a completely different kind of structure is starting to make the traditional tiny home look slow, expensive, and unnecessarily complicated by comparison. It is called the mini Quonset hut, and if you have never heard of it, you are about to understand why more and more people who set out wanting a tiny home are ending up with one of these instead. Stick with me here, because the reason why is not what most people expect. Here is what you need to understand first. The traditional tiny home movement started with a genuinely good idea. Live smaller, spend less, own your space outright instead of renting forever or drowning in a 30-year mortgage. For a lot of Americans, it represented the first realistic path toward actually owning something, rather than writing a check to a landlord every single month for the rest of their working lives. But somewhere between the good idea and the finished product, something consistently went wrong. Building a traditional tiny home, even a small one, still requires most of the same steps as building a full-size house. You need permits. You need a contractor or serious personal construction experience. You need a foundation or an expensive trailer chassis. You need framing, insulation, drywall, roofing, windows, and dozens of decisions that each carry their own cost and their own timeline. Every single step compounds on the one before it. And most people researching this from the outside have absolutely no idea how quickly those layers add up. A guy named Tyler found this out the hard way. He had watched every tiny home documentary available. He had a budget of $30,000 and a clear plan in his head. What he did not have was a realistic picture of how long every single step of the process was actually going to take once the real world got involved. His $30,000 budget became $52,000. His 6-month timeline stretched into 18 months. By the end of it, Tyler had a finished tiny home he was genuinely proud of, but a bank account and a reserve of patience that had both been completely drained in the process. He is not unusual. He is almost exactly typical. This is the part nobody tells you clearly when the tiny home lifestyle gets sold through a beautifully edited television episode. The finished product looks effortless. The process behind it rarely is. And this gap between what people see on screen and what they actually experience on the ground is precisely why the mini Quonset hut is starting to win an argument it was not even supposed to be part of. The Quonset hut itself is not a new invention. If you have ever seen old military photographs from World War II, you have already seen a Quonset hut. The United States military needed a structure that could be shipped anywhere in the world, assembled with minimal tools and minimal training, and hold up against extreme weather in locations where no traditional builder would ever be available. The original Quonset hut solved every one of those problems efficiently. It was a half-cylinder corrugated steel, curved from the ground to the peak, with no complex framing, no right angles to square, and no specialized knowledge required to put together correctly. It was, in the most practical sense possible, a building that simply worked. What is happening right now is that a new generation of builders and buyers has looked at that 80-year-old design and asked a genuinely interesting question. What if you made it smaller, more refined, and built it specifically for the way people actually want to live today? Not for military camps, not for farm storage. For a real, daily, comfortable human life. The answer is the mini Quonset hut. And here's the part that matters most. The people who have already made this switch are describing an experience that sounds almost nothing like what Tyler went through. A guy named Jason built his mini Quonset on a weekend property in Colorado. He describes the assembly process as closer to building furniture than building a house. The panels are preformed, pre-curved, and engineered to bolt together in a specific sequence that any person willing to follow a set of instructions can actually execute. If you can operate a basic set of hand tools and work methodically through a manual, you can put one of these structures together without hiring a single contractor. Jason did it with his brother and a college friend. 3 men, 1 weekend, 1 finished shell standing solid at the end of Sunday evening. That is not a marketing claim. That is a description of what the product actually delivers. But here is where the story gets more interesting, because quick assembly alone is not enough to explain why people are choosing this over a traditional tiny home. There are plenty of fast structures you could throw together that nobody would actually want to live in. The reason the mini Quonset is earning serious attention comes down to what the shape itself does structurally once it is standing. The arch, which looks primarily aesthetic from the outside, is doing serious engineering work. A curved surface distributes weight, wind pressure, and snow load across its entire span rather than concentrating stress at the corners and joints the way a rectangular structure does. This means a mini Quonset can handle conditions that would genuinely challenge a comparably sized traditional tiny home without significantly more complex and expensive engineering underneath it. A guy named Evan converted his mini Quonset into a full-time primary residence. He built out a kitchen along one wall, a sleeping loft tucked into the back quarter of the arch, a bathroom, and a compact office space where he works remotely 3 days a week. His total interior build cost came in under $20,000. He carries no mortgage. He has no landlord. His monthly living expenses are lower than anything he experienced across 10 years of renting apartments in 3 different cities. That number deserves a full second of your attention. Under $20,000 for a complete, livable, permanently owned space. There's almost nothing else available in the American housing market right now that can make that claim honestly. But here is the question most people researching mini Quonsets are genuinely most worried about, and it deserves a straight answer. What about permits? What about zoning laws? Does a structure like this actually qualify as a legal place to live? The honest answer is that it depends significantly on where you are building, and the variation is real. In rural areas and on privately owned land across many states, a structure of this size frequently falls below the threshold that triggers the full residential permitting process. A guy named Carl built his mini Quonset on 5 acres in rural Texas and was required to pull only a simple accessory structure permit. The process took 3 days and cost under $200 in fees. In other locations, particularly inside incorporated towns and suburban zoning districts, the situation is more complicated. Some municipalities have not yet established clear regulatory pathways for arch-style residential structures, and builders in those areas have had to work directly with county planning offices to determine how the building gets classified and what standards apply. This requires patience. It is not impossible, but it does require real conversations and real research before you break ground. The honest summary is this. If you are building on rural or semi-rural land, and you are willing to spend time researching the specific rules for your county before you purchase anything, a mini Quonset is almost always more permitting friendly than a traditional tiny home on a permanent foundation. If you are attempting to build inside a subdivision governed by strict residential codes, you will face the same complications that any non-standard residential structure faces in that kind of environment. Now here is something worth thinking about that most people overlook until they are already well into the process. What happens to the value of a mini Quonset over time? Traditional homes in stable markets generally appreciate. Traditional tiny homes have a more complicated relationship with long-term value, partly because their resale market is genuinely narrower, and partly because many of them sit on trailer frames, which creates complicated questions around land ownership, financing, and permanent valuation. A mini Quonset built on owned land is a permanent structure on a foundation. It is legally and financially part of the property beneath it. A guy named Robert in rural Oregon built 2 mini Quonsets on a 5-acre parcel. He used one as his personal residence and rented the second as a short-term vacation rental. Within 2 years, the rental income from that second structure had fully covered his original build cost on it. He now owns both outright, with no debt attached to either one, on land that has continued to appreciate since he first purchased it. That is not a guaranteed outcome, but it is what happens when a low-cost, durable structure gets paired with clear-eyed thinking about how the land it sits on actually works. Here's the thing that rarely gets said when someone shows you the glossy, finished photographs of a traditional tiny home on a blog or a listing site. The lifestyle that comes with the finished product is only as good as the process that got you there. If that process broke you financially, exhausted you emotionally, or took so long that you lost real momentum and real joy somewhere in the middle of it, the finished product carries all of that weight with it invisibly. The men switching to mini Quonsets are not abandoning the original dream. They are choosing a path toward that exact dream that does not require them to sacrifice 2 years of their life and an extra $20,000 just to get through the door. They are choosing a structure that goes up fast, holds up hard, costs less to build, and sits permanently on land they actually own outright. Marcus, the man who stood at his fence watching Derek put up that structure on a Sunday evening, eventually built his own mini Quonset on a separate piece of land he purchased the following year. He has been living in it for 14 months. He describes it as the most straightforward and genuinely satisfying building project he has ever completed from beginning to end. He still owns his traditional tiny home. He rents it out to a young couple who found on a listing site and love the look of it. The rental income covers the property taxes on both parcels combined. He says he does not regret the tiny home. He built it. He finished it. He is proud of it. But he says if he is being fully honest, he wishes he had heard about the Quonset first. That sentence is, in a lot of ways, the whole story here. A better option was available. Most people simply had no